I remember when I first met him, not on my wedding day, surprisingly, but 3 weeks after. Richard Kavanaugh, my father-in-law, the man who would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. Emma and I had opted for a courthouse wedding. Small, intimate, just us and a handful of friends. Neither set of parents made it. Mine because they'd never really approved of what they called my rushed engagement, and hers because her father had been in the hospital. A minor heart scare, she'd said. Nothing serious, but enough to keep them grounded in Montana while we exchanged vows in Boston. I was 26 then, with a master's degree in architecture and a junior position at a firm that paid just enough for us to afford our one-bedroom apartment overlooking the Charles River. Emma was 24, a kindergarten teacher with a laugh that could fill a room. We'd been together for 2 years, long enough, we thought, to know this was right. "They're going to love you," she said, as our rental car climbed the winding mountain road. Outside the window, Montana unfurled in watercolor strokes of green and gold. "My dad can be a little intense sometimes, but once he warms up to you, God, it'll be like you're the son he never had." I nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety in my chest. Emma had always spoken of her father with a reverence that bordered on awe. He was the standard against which she measured all men, myself included. A former commercial airline pilot now retired to run the family ranch, Richard Kavanaugh was, in his daughter's words, the kind of man mountains move aside for. The house came into view as we rounded the final bend, a sprawling timber and stone structure hugging the mountainside, with floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the late afternoon sun like sheets of copper. A man stood on the front porch, watching our approach. Even from this distance, his posture spoke of confidence, of permanence, like he was as much a part of this landscape as the mountains themselves. "There's Dad," Emma said, her face lighting up. I remember thinking, as we pulled into the driveway, that she hadn't mentioned how handsome her father was. The first handshake lasted too long. His palm was rough against mine, calloused from ranch work, but warm. His eyes were the same startling jade green as Emma's, but where hers danced with constant movement, his were steady, assessing. He was tall, taller than me by at least 3 inches, with salt and pepper hair cropped close at the sides but longer on top. The lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into horizons. "So you're the architect who stole my little girl," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the points where our hands connected. "Guilty as charged, sir," I replied, aiming for lightness, but hearing the nervousness in my own voice. His mouth curved into a half-smile. "Call me Richard. Sir makes me feel like I'm back in the cockpit." That first evening blurred into a montage of introductions to Emma's mother, Catherine, a warm woman with pianist's hands and a ready laugh, to the sprawling ranch house with its exposed beams and stone hearths, to Montana itself, which seemed to breathe around us as dusk settled over the mountains. Dinner was elk steaks that Richard had hunted himself, grilled on the deck overlooking the valley. Catherine had set the outdoor table with a casual elegance, wildflowers in mason jars, mismatched vintage china. Emma fell easily into the rhythms of her childhood home, helping her mother in the familiar dance of serving and clearing. I offered to help, but Richard waved me down. "First night, you're a guest," he said, refilling my wine glass. "Tomorrow, your family. That's when we put you to work." There was something in the way he said family that made me glance up. Our eyes met across the table, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. For a split second, something electric passed between us. A current of recognition so unexpected that I immediately dismissed it as imagination. Later, as we all sat around the fire pit on the deck, the conversation drifted to how Emma and I had met, a chance encounter at a friend's gallery opening. As Emma told the story, Richard's eyes never left my face. Not in a challenging way, but with a curiosity that felt almost intimate, like he was trying to read something written beneath my skin. "What drew you to Emma, first time you saw her?" he asked suddenly during a lull in the conversation. The question caught me off guard. Emma and her mother had gone inside to fetch dessert, leaving us momentarily alone. The fire painted his features in amber light and shadow. "Her laugh," I said honestly. She laughed at something across the room, and I turned because it was the most genuine sound I'd ever heard. Something changed in his expression then. A softening around the eyes, a subtle shift that transformed his face. "I've always said you can tell everything about a person by their laugh," he said quietly. "Some people laugh from their throats. The special ones laugh from somewhere deeper." Before I could respond, his hand reached out, resting briefly on my shoulder. The weight of it felt significant somehow, like an anchor. It lingered there, 1 second, 2, 3, before he withdrew it as Emma and Catherine returned with apple pie and ice cream. That touch, casual as it seemed, left an imprint of warmth through my shirt that I found myself still feeling hours later, lying beside Emma in her childhood bedroom. "Your dad is not what I expected," I whispered into the darkness, not sure if she was still awake. "Hmm?" she murmured sleepily. "Good, not what you expected. Or bad." I stared at the ceiling, trying to articulate something I couldn't name. "Good, I think. Just different, more intense," she supplied. "Yeah, intense." She curled closer against me. "Told you. He's got that way of looking at you like he can see right through you. Used to terrify my high school boyfriends." I didn't tell her that it wasn't terror I'd felt under Richard's gaze. It was something entirely different, a sensation of being truly seen, perhaps for the first time. The next morning, Richard found me alone in the kitchen. I'd woken early, restless in the unfamiliar bed, careful not to disturb Emma as I slipped out. The house was silent, bathed in the pale blue light of dawn. I was fumbling with the elaborate coffee machine when I sensed his presence. "Here," he said, reaching around me to press a sequence of buttons. His chest was inches from my back, his arm extending alongside mine. He smelled of cedar and something earthier, a scent uniquely his. "Catherine insists on this European monstrosity. Makes the best damn coffee you'll ever taste, but you need an engineering degree to operate it." I was acutely aware of how close he stood, how the kitchen suddenly seemed to shrink around his presence. When I turned slightly, his face was near enough that I could see the morning stubble on his jaw, silver threading through the dark. "Thanks," I managed. I was about ready to admit defeat. He stepped back, leaning against the counter with an ease that made me envious. He wore faded jeans and a simple gray t-shirt that did little to hide the fact that, at 48, he remained in remarkable shape. Ranch work, I supposed, was its own kind of fitness regimen. "You're up early," he observed. "Emma still sleeps like the dead, I take it?" I nodded, smiling. "Out cold. She can sleep through anything." "Gets that from her mother," he said, a fond smile playing at his lips. "When I was still flying, I'd come home at all hours. Catherine would never stir, not even when I'd crawl into bed at 3 a.m. after a trans-Pacific route." The coffee machine gurgled between us, filling the kitchen with the rich aroma of espresso. "You miss it?" I asked. "Flying?" Something crossed his face then, a shadow of longing so naked that I almost looked away, feeling like I'd intruded on something private. "Every day," he said simply. "There's nothing like it, being suspended between earth and sky, responsible for all those lives, yet absolutely free." He paused, his eyes finding mine with unexpected intensity. "People think piloting is about the machine, the technical skill, but it's not. It's about understanding invisible forces, air currents, pressure systems, the subtle shifts that can change everything in an instant." The coffee finished brewing, but neither of us moved to pour it. "Sort of like architecture," I said, surprised by the parallel that formed in my mind. "People think it's about the structure, the materials, but it's really about understanding how space affects human movement, human emotion." His eyebrows lifted slightly, his expression changing to one of genuine interest. "I hadn't thought of it that way. You're right." He pushed off from the counter, stepped closer. "Tell me more about your work." And so I did, there in the slowly brightening kitchen, explaining my fascination with the way buildings shape human experience, the projects I was working on, my frustrations with the firm's preference for profit over innovation. He asked questions that revealed a mind that grasped concepts quickly, that sought deeper meaning. He listened in a way few people ever had, with his full attention, as if my words were water and he was parched. I don't know how long we talked before Emma wandered in, hair tousled from sleep, but by then, something had shifted between Richard and me. A connection had formed, tenuous but undeniable, an unspoken recognition of kinship that both confused and exhilarated me. Throughout that day, I found myself increasingly aware of his presence. The timbre of his laugh during lunch on the deck, the sure movements of his hands as he showed me around the ranch, the way the afternoon light caught in his eyes as he pointed out landmarks in the distance. Each moment seemed to carry a weight, a significance that I couldn't explain even to myself. That evening, Emma's mother insisted on showing us their wedding album, a leather-bound collection of photographs from 26 years earlier. We all gathered on the oversized sectional in the great room, Catherine nestled beside Emma, the album open across their laps. Richard and I sat across from them, an appropriate distance between us that nonetheless felt charged with awareness. "Look how young Dad was!" Emma exclaimed, pointing at a photo of Richard in his Air Force dress uniform, Catherine radiant beside him. "I was your age," Richard said, his eyes finding mine. 26. Thought I knew everything there was to know about life." His mouth quirked in a self-deprecating smile. "Turns out I didn't know a damn thing." "You knew enough to marry me," Catherine quipped, reaching across to pat his knee affectionately. "Best decision I ever made," he replied, but there was something in his voice, a flatness perhaps, or a too-practiced quality, that caught my attention. Catherine didn't seem to notice, already turning the page to show Emma another photograph. Later, as Emma and her mother cleared dessert plates, Richard suggested we step outside for some air. The night was clear, stars scattered like spilled salt across the black canvas of the Montana sky. We stood on the deck in companionable silence, the vastness of the landscape spread before us. "Emma tells me you never knew your father," he said finally, his voice gentle. The statement surprised me, not because it wasn't true, but because Emma had shared that detail with him. "No," I confirmed. "He left when I was 2. I don't remember him." Richard nodded slowly, contemplating the darkness beyond the deck railing. "That shapes a man, growing up without a father. Leaves. Spaces inside you. Empty rooms no one taught you how to fill." His words resonated with such unexpected accuracy that I felt momentarily exposed, like he'd reached inside me and touched a bruise I'd forgotten was there. "I suppose it does," I said carefully. He turned to face me then, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something, son? And I want an honest answer." My heart rate picked up, though I couldn't have said why. "Of course." "Are you happy? Truly happy?" The question hung in the cold mountain air between us. In the 3 days since we'd arrived, Richard had barely asked me any of the expected questions about my career prospects, my intentions toward Emma, our plans for children. Instead, he'd gone straight to the marrow. I began, then stopped, suddenly unsure. With a jolt, I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked me that question. Not my friends, not my mother, not even Emma. "I think so," I finally said. "I mean, I have everything I'm supposed to want." He studied me for a long moment. "That's not what I asked." A gust of wind swept across the deck, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. I shivered, though not entirely from the cold. "I don't know," I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could examine it. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life, like I made all the right moves in the right order, but—" I trailed off, shocked by my own candor. Richard stepped closer then, close enough that I could see the faint lines etched around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. Without warning, his hand came up to rest on my shoulder, the same gesture from the night before, but this time his thumb brushed against the bare skin of my neck, just above my collar. "I know exactly what you mean," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've lived with that feeling for 20 years. The admission hung between us, heavy with implication. His hand remained on my shoulder, the point of contact radiating warmth that seemed to spread through my entire body. I knew I should step back, make a joke, break whatever this was that was building between us. Instead, I found myself leaning slightly into his touch, my eyes locked with his. A sound from inside, Emma laughing at something her mother said, broke the moment. Richard's hand fell away, and he took a step back, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "We should head in," he said, his voice returning to its normal register. "Storm's coming." He was right. In the distance, lightning flickered soundlessly over the mountains. But as we turned to go back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been talking about something else entirely. The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality. Moments of ordinary family vacation interspersed with electric instances of connection that left me increasingly confused and conflicted. There was the afternoon Richard taught me to chop wood, standing behind me to demonstrate the proper technique, his arms around me, hands covering mine on the axe handle. "It's all in the follow-through," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "Don't stop halfway." There was the evening Emma fell asleep on the couch during a movie, and Richard and I ended up talking until 2 a.m., sharing whiskey and increasingly personal stories. He told me about his first solo flight, the exhilaration and terror of being alone in the cockpit. I told him about my childhood dreams of designing buildings that would change skylines. Our knees touched beneath the coffee table. Neither of us moved away. There was the hiking expedition where Catherine and Emma raced ahead on the trail, leaving Richard and me to follow at our own pace. We paused at a lookout point. The valley stretched below us like a living painting. "Beauty like this makes you question everything you think you know," he said, standing close enough that our shoulders touched. When I turned to respond, his face was inches from mine, his eyes reflecting the endless blue of the Montana sky. Each night, I lay beside Emma, listening to her steady breathing, my mind replaying moments with her father. The guilt was a physical presence, a weight on my chest. I told myself I was imagining things, that the connection I felt with Richard was merely the natural bond between a son-in-law and father-in-law, perhaps intensified by my own fatherless upbringing. But then there would be another moment, his fingertips brushing mine as he passed me a coffee mug, his eyes finding mine across the dinner table, the particular smile he seemed to reserve just for me. And I knew, with increasing certainty, that whatever was happening between us was neither ordinary nor innocent. On our final night in Montana, Emma and her mother decided to drive into town for last-minute shopping and dinner with Catherine's sister. Richard begged off, claiming paperwork for the ranch needed attention. I offered to stay behind as well, citing a deadline for a project I could work on remotely. Emma kissed me goodbye, her lips familiar and sweet. "You two bond," she said, squeezing my hand. "Dad doesn't let many people in. I'm glad he likes you." The word sent a fresh wave of guilt through me. Likes you. Such a simple phrase for the complex current that ran between her father and me. After they left, the house fell into silence. I tried to focus on my laptop, on the building renderings that needed my attention, but my awareness of Richard somewhere in the house made concentration impossible. Eventually, I gave up, closing my computer and wandering out to the deck. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in dramatic strokes of crimson and gold. I stood at the railing, watching as the colors deepened, trying to memorize the vista before we returned to our Boston apartment with its limited views of brick and concrete. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Richard's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, 2 glasses of amber liquid in his hands. He crossed to join me at the railing, offering one of the glasses. "Last sunset of your visit," he said. "Thought it deserved a toast." I accepted the whiskey, careful not to let our fingers touch. "Thank you." We stood side by side, watching as the sun slipped behind the mountains, leaving a kaleidoscope of purples and blues in its wake. The first stars appeared, hesitant pinpricks of light in the darkening canvas. "I'm going to miss this view," I said, sipping the whiskey. It burned pleasantly down my throat. "Just the view?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer immediately, afraid of what I might say. Finally, I managed, "The whole place. It's been revelatory." He turned toward me, his expression solemn in the gathering darkness. "What's been revealed?" The question hung between us, fraught with potential meanings. I looked down at my glass, swirling the remaining liquid. "I'm not sure I can put it into words," I hedged. "Try," he said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. "Please." Something in his tone, a vulnerability, a plea, made me look up. His eyes, even in the dim light of dusk, were intense with emotion. I felt seen here, I admitted, in a way I haven't before. It's like... I struggled for the words. It's like I've been playing a part for so long, I forgot there was a real person underneath. And somehow, you... I stopped, the implications of what I was about to say, too dangerous to voice. Richard set his glass on the railing and turned fully toward me. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and placed his hand on my chest, directly over my heart. I know, he said simply. I know, because I feel it too. His touch burned through my shirt like a brand. I should have stepped back. I should have made a joke, changed the subject, done anything to break the growing tension. Instead, I stood frozen, my heart hammering against his palm. This is wrong, I whispered, but I didn't move away. Is it? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Or is it the first honest thing either of us has felt in years? The air between us seemed to crackle with electricity. His face was so close now that I could see the individual flecks of gold in his green eyes, smell the whiskey on his breath, mingling with that cedar scent that was uniquely his. Richard, I said, his name feeling intimate in a way it hadn't before. I'm married to your daughter. I know. His hand moved from my chest to the side of my face, his calloused palm rough against my cheek. God help me, I know. We stood on the precipice of something irreversible, something that would shatter the lives we'd built. The rational part of my brain screamed warnings, but another part, a part I'd never acknowledged, yearned to lean into his touch, to discover what lay beyond this threshold. The sound of tires on gravel shattered the moment. Richard dropped his hand and stepped back as if burned. They're back early, he said, his voice returning to normal with jarring speed. I reached for my whiskey with a shaking hand and drained it in one swallow, desperate to regain my composure before Emma and Catherine entered the house. Richard moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to me. In the last light of evening, his expression was a study in conflict, desire warring with restraint, longing with responsibility. There's something I need to tell you, he said, his voice low and urgent. Something I have never told anyone, not even Catherine. My heart, which had just begun to slow, raced again. What is it? He glanced toward the driveway, where car doors were now slamming. When he looked back at me, his eyes held a desperate intensity. I've spent my whole life living a lie, he said, the words rushing out as if he feared losing his courage. Every choice, every path I've taken, they were all what I was supposed to want, what others expected. I built this life, this marriage, this image of myself, but underneath it all... He swallowed hard. I've always known I was... The sound of the front door opening threw him off. Voices, Emma's and Catherine's, echoed through the house. Dad? Nathan? We're back! Richard's eyes held mine, filled with words left unspoken, with the weight of a confession half delivered. Then he turned and walked back into the house, leaving me alone on the deck, my heart hammering against my ribs, my mind reeling with the implications of what he'd been about to say. I stood there in the gathering darkness, the empty whiskey glass cold in my hand, knowing that whatever he had been about to confess had the power to change everything. For him, for me, for all of us. I don't remember how I made it through the rest of that night. Somehow, I smiled through dinner. I helped pack the car. I kissed Emma goodnight and held her close, breathing in her familiar vanilla scent, trying to anchor myself in the reality of our marriage as my mind kept circling back to those interrupted words on the deck. I've spent my whole life living a lie. What had Richard been about to confess? The question haunted me as I lay beside Emma, listening to her soft breathing, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. The guilt was a physical presence now, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I slipped out of bed around 3 a.m., careful not to wake her, and made my way to the kitchen for water. The house was silent, moonlight spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the open-plan living area in shades of silver and shadow. I stood at the sink, glass in hand, staring out at the mountains silhouetted against the star-speckled sky. Tomorrow, no, Today, we would leave this place, return to Boston, to our apartment, to our life. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it filled me with a hollow ache I couldn't name. Couldn't sleep either? The voice behind me made me start, water sloshing over the rim of my glass. I turned to find Richard standing in the entrance to the kitchen, barefoot, wearing flannel pajama pants and a faded Air Force t-shirt. His hair was tousled from sleep, or perhaps from the same restlessness that had driven me from bed. "No," I managed, setting the glass down carefully. "Too much on my mind." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us charged with all that had been said and unsaid on the deck hours earlier. "Nathan," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words, a rarity for a man who always appeared so sure of himself. "About earlier. We don't have to talk about it," I interrupted, suddenly afraid of what he might say, of what lines might be crossed in the pre-dawn darkness with the rest of the house asleep. "It's fine. We got carried away. The whiskey, the sunset." I was babbling, desperate to provide us both an escape route. Richard took a step closer, his expression somber in the dim light. "Is that what you think happened? We got carried away." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "What else could it be?" "The truth," he said simply. The word hung between us, weighted with possibility. I forced myself to look at him then, really look at him. The strong line of his jaw, the silver threading through his dark hair, the way his eyes seemed to hold a lifetime of unexpressed feelings. "And what is the truth, Richard?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He took another step toward me, close enough now that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "The truth is that from the moment you stepped out of that car, I felt something I haven't felt in decades. Something I've spent my entire adult life trying to bury so deep it would never see daylight." He paused, his eyes searching mine. "And I think, God help me, I think you feel it too." My heart hammered against my ribs, so loud I was certain he must hear it. Denial rose to my lips automatically, the safe response, the right response. But I couldn't force it out. Not here. Here, not now. Not with him looking at me like I was water in a desert. "I'm married to your daughter," I said instead, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. "I know," he replied, pain flashing across his features. "Christ, don't you think I know that? Don't you think I've been telling myself exactly that since the moment I shook your hand?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "I'm her father. I'm supposed to protect her, not want." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The unspoken desire hung in the air between us, impossible to ignore any longer. "This can't happen," I whispered, even as I made no move to increase the distance between us. "We can't." "I know," he said again, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we can't, but Nathan—" He reached out, his hand hovering just shy of touching my face. "Can you honestly tell me you don't feel this connection? Because if you can look me in the eye and tell me I'm alone in this madness, I'll never speak of it again." I should have lied. Should have denied everything, ended this dangerous game before it destroyed us all. Instead, I found myself leaning slightly toward his outstretched hand, my body betraying what my mind knew was wrong. "I can't tell you that," I admitted, the words barely audible. "God help me, Richard, I can't." His fingertips brushed my cheek then, the touch so gentle it was barely there, yet it sent electricity coursing through me. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity, suspended in that fragile moment of acknowledgement. A floorboard creaked somewhere above us, the sound shattering the moment. We jumped apart like guilty teenagers, Richard turning away to fill a glass with water, me leaning against the counter with forced casualness. But the charge remained in the air, undeniable now that it had been named. "We leave after breakfast," I said quietly, when it became clear no one was coming down the stairs. Richard nodded, his back still to me. "I know." "What happens then?" I asked, hating the vulnerability in my voice. He turned back to face me, his expression a complex mixture of resignation and longing. "Nothing happens," he said firmly. "You go back to Boston. You live your life with Emma. You forget this. Whatever this is." "Just like that?" His jaw tightened. "Just like that." I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man who had just bared his soul with this sudden retreat into practicality. "And what about you? What do you do?" Something flashed in his eyes, pain perhaps, or a deeper resignation. "The same thing I've done for the past 25 years, he said flatly. "I keep playing the role I chose." Before I could respond, he set his untouched water on the counter and walked past me, careful not to let our bodies brush. At the kitchen doorway, he paused, not turning around. "Good night, Nathan. Get some sleep. Long drive tomorrow." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the moonlit kitchen with a mountain of questions and a hollowness in my chest that felt dangerously like loss. The departure the next morning was a blur of forced normalcy. Emma and her mother hugged tearfully, exchanging promises of a Christmas visit. I loaded our bags into the rental car, my movements mechanical, my mind elsewhere. And then there was Richard, standing on the porch steps, hands in the pockets of his worn jeans. He hugged Emma fiercely, murmuring something in her ear that made her laugh through her tears. Then it was my turn. We'd avoided each other at breakfast, exchanging only the most necessary pleasantries. Now, with Emma and Catherine watching, we had no choice but to play our parts. "Take care, son," he said, pulling me into an embrace that, to anyone watching, would appear perfectly ordinary. A father-in-law saying goodbye to his daughter's husband. But I felt the slight tremor in his arms, heard the catch in his breath as his cheek brushed mine. "You too," I managed, pulling away before I could do something stupid, something revealing. As we drove down the winding mountain road, Emma waved out the window until her parents were tiny figures on the porch and then disappeared from view entirely. She settled back in her seat with a sigh, reaching for my hand on the console. "That went really well, don't you think?" she said, squeezing my fingers. "Dad really took to you. I've never seen him open up to someone so quickly." I kept my eyes fixed on the road, afraid of what she might see if I turned to her. "He's a good man," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "A good man I can't stop thinking about. A good man I'm betraying you for, even in my thoughts." "The best," she agreed, oblivious to my internal turmoil. "Though I warned you he could be intense." I nearly laughed at the understatement. Intense. Such a simple word for the hurricane that had torn through my carefully constructed life in the span of a week. Boston welcomed us back with a heat wave, the city sweltering under an August sun that turned our apartment into an oven. We fell back into our routines, Emma teaching summer school, me at the architecture firm. But something had shifted. At least for me, I moved through my days like an actor who had forgotten his lines, going through motions that once felt natural, but now seemed foreign. At night, I would lie awake beside Emma, haunted by memories of Montana. Richard's hand on my shoulder, his voice rough with emotion, the words he'd almost said on the deck. I've always known I was... What? Gay? Bisexual? Living a lie? I turned the possibilities over in my mind, examining them from every angle, searching for the truth behind his unfinished confession. 2 weeks after our return, Emma's phone rang during dinner. Her face lit up when she saw the caller ID. "Dad!" she exclaimed, putting the phone on the speaker and setting it on the table between us. "We were just talking about you." We hadn't been, but I didn't correct her, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth at the sound of Richard's voice filling our small dining area. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, the familiar timbre sending an unwelcome shiver down my spine. "Just checking in. How's the heat wave treating you two?" "It's brutal," Emma replied, fanning herself dramatically though he couldn't see her. "The AC in the apartment is struggling to keep up. But Nathan's firm has excellent climate control. Don't you, babe?" She looked at me expectantly. I cleared my throat, willing my voice to sound normal. "It's not bad," I managed. "How's Montana?" There was a slight pause before Richard answered, and I wondered if he'd been caught off guard by my question, by the sound of my voice. "Beautiful as always," he said finally. "Though we could use some rain. It's been a dry summer." The conversation continued, Richard and Emma carrying most of it while I interjected only when necessary. I studied my plate, pushing pasta around with my fork, hyper-aware of every inflection in Richard's voice, every pause, every chuckle. It was torture and fascination in equal measure. As they were saying goodbye, Emma suddenly said, "Oh, wait! Wait, Dad, before you go, Nathan got some amazing news today. Tell him, babe." I looked up, startled. The promotion. I'd almost forgotten telling Emma about it when I got home. "It's nothing, really," I said, uncomfortable being the center of attention. "Just a step up at the firm, junior project lead instead of just an associate." "Don't be modest," Emma chided. "It's a big deal. He'll be heading the redesign for that community center in Dorchester." She added to her father, "His own project, start to finish." "Congratulations," Richard said, his voice warm in a way that tugged at something deep inside me. "That's excellent news, Nathan. Well deserved, I'm sure." "Thank you," I replied, staring at the phone as if I could see through it to him. "It means a lot." After they hung up, Emma beamed at me across the table. "He really does like you," she said. "I can tell." I forced a smile, guilt twisting like a knife in my gut. "I like him too," I said, the understatement of the century. That night, I dreamed of Montana, of standing on the deck with Richard, the sun setting behind the mountains. But in the dream, we weren't interrupted. In the dream, he finished his confession. In the dream, I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to his, feeling his arms wrap around me with desperate need. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, Emma sleeping peacefully beside me. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face, avoiding my reflection in the mirror. I didn't want to see the man I was becoming, a liar, a betrayer. I told myself it was just a dream, that I could control my thoughts, my feelings, that whatever madness had possessed me in Montana would fade with time and distance. I was wrong. September bled into October, the Boston trees turning to bachar, the air growing crisp. Emma talked to her parents weekly, sometimes on speaker, sometimes not. Each time I heard Richard's voice, something inside me both tightened and loosened, a paradoxical response I couldn't control. I found myself manufacturing reasons to be out of the apartment during their scheduled calls, unable to trust myself, afraid she would see something in my face when his voice filled the room. My project at work consumed me, a welcome distraction from the thoughts I couldn't seem to banish. I stayed late at the office, buried myself in blueprints and consultations and zoning regulations. Emma complained about my hours, about the growing distance between us, but seemed to accept my explanation that this project could make my career. And then, in early November, an email arrived in my work inbox that stopped my heart. Subject: Boston Architectural Symposium, speaker confirmation, from Richard Kavanaugh. I stared at the sender's name, sure I was hallucinating. But no, there it was, the message preview visible below. "Nathan, I'll be in Boston next week for an aviation symposium and saw your firm is hosting a panel on sustainable urban design. As a former pilot with an interest in..." With shaking fingers, I clicked the email open, reading Richard's carefully professional message. He explained that he would be in Boston the following week for an aviation industry event. Had seen that my firm was hosting an architectural symposium focused on sustainability and was interested in attending. He asked if I could secure him an invitation, as the event appeared to be industry only. The email was perfectly innocuous, the kind of request a father-in-law might reasonably make of his daughter's husband. There was nothing in it that would raise an eyebrow if Emma happened to see it. Nothing except the fact that Richard had emailed me directly instead of mentioning it to Emma during their weekly calls. Nothing except the fact that my heart was racing as if I'd run a marathon. I stared at my computer screen for a long time, cursor hovering over the reply button. This was a test of my resolve, of my commitment to the line we'd drawn that night in the kitchen. The professional thing, the right thing, would be to forward the email to our events coordinator, have her send Richard the standard guest registration link, and maintain my distance. Instead, I hit reply and typed, "Richard, good to hear from you. I'd be happy to add you to the guest list for the symposium." It's next Thursday, 6-9 p.m. at the Meridian Hotel downtown. I'll be presenting in the second panel session on adaptive reuse of historical buildings. Let me know if you need any other information. Nathan, I read it over 3 times, scrutinizing every word for hidden meanings, for anything that might betray the chaotic swirl of emotions his email had unleashed. Finding it appropriately bland, I hit send before I could change my mind. His response came less than 5 minutes later. Nathan, thank you for the quick reply. I've added it to my calendar. Looking forward to seeing your presentation. I'll be staying at the Meridian, actually. Convenient coincidence. Perhaps we can grab coffee before the event, if your schedule allows. I'd be interested to hear more about this community center project Emma mentioned. Richard Coffey. Innocent enough. A father-in-law taking an interest in his son-in-law's career. Nothing anyone could question. But my hands were trembling as I typed my response. Coffee works. There's a decent place in the hotel lobby. 4:30? His reply was immediate. Perfect. See you then. I closed my email and stared out the window at the Boston skyline, watching as the setting sun painted the glass towers in shades of amber and gold. What was I doing? What game was I playing? And more importantly, what did Richard want from this meeting? I told myself it was nothing, just professional courtesy, familial connection. I told myself I was reading too much into a simple coffee meeting. I told myself a lot of things in the days that followed, none of which explained why I changed my outfit 3 times the morning of our meeting, or why my palms were sweating as I pushed through the revolving doors of the Meridian Hotel at precisely 4:25 p.m. The lobby cafe was busy with the afternoon crowd, business people between meetings, tourists resting tired feet. I scanned the tables, my pulse quickening when I didn't immediately see him. Had he changed his mind? Had I misunderstood? Nathan. The voice came from behind me. I turned to find Richard standing there, and the sight of him after 3 months hit me like a physical blow. He was dressed more formally than I'd seen him in Montana. Charcoal slacks, a blue button-down shirt open at the collar, a navy blazer. His hair was freshly cut, the silver at his temples catching the light. He looked like what he was, a successful, attractive man in his prime, and nothing like the image of him I'd carried in my mind, the one I'd tried so hard to exercise. Richard, I managed, extending my hand in what I hoped was a normal greeting. He took it, his grip firm, lingering just a fraction longer than propriety demanded. Good to see you, he said, his eyes never leaving mine. We found a table in the corner, ordered coffee from a harried server. For a few minutes, we maintained the facade. He asked about the community center project. I inquired about the aviation symposium. Surface talk, safe talk, the kind that couldn't possibly betray the undercurrents swirling beneath. But then, during a lull in the conversation, he set down his coffee cup and looked at me directly, all pretense falling away. How are you, Nathan? Really? The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, cracked something open inside me. I don't know, I admitted, my voice low. I'm functioning, I guess. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Emma doesn't suspect anything. There's nothing to suspect, I said automatically, but the words rang hollow even to my own ears. Nothing happened. Didn't it? He asked quietly. I stared at him, at the face that had haunted my dreams for 3 months. You know what I mean. I do, he acknowledged. Physically, nothing happened. But Nathan... He leaned forward slightly. Something happened. Something neither of us expected or sought out. Something I have been trying to understand ever since you left. My heart hammered against my ribs. Around us, the cafe bustled with activity, people coming and going, conversations rising and falling, but it all seemed distant, as if Richard and I existed in our own bubble of time and space. And have you? I asked. Understood it. A shadow crossed his face. No, he admitted. Not entirely, but I know that seeing you walk away that day felt like... He trailed off, seeming to search for the right words. Like watching a door close on something I didn't even know I wanted until it was too late. His candor took my breath away. In Montana, our conversations had been laden with subtext, with implications and unfinished thoughts. This directness was new, terrifying in its clarity. "Richard," I began, not sure what I was going to say, only knowing I needed to say something to break the intensity of the moment. "I've never felt this way about a man before," he interrupted, his voice so low I had to lean forward to hear him. "Never even considered the possibility. I told myself it was just, I don't know, some midlife crisis, some bizarre transference. I told myself a lot of things during those weeks after you left." He met my eyes then, his gaze steady despite the vulnerability of his words. None of them changed the fact that I couldn't stop thinking about you. The confession hung in the air between us, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. I should have been shocked, should have recoiled from the implications. Instead, I felt a perverse relief, validation that I wasn't alone in this madness, that the connection I'd felt hadn't been one-sided delusion. "I tried," I said finally. "God, Richard, I tried so hard to forget whatever it was that happened in Montana, to focus on Emma, on my work, on anything but." I gestured helplessly between us. "But this—" "And did it work?" he asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. I laughed, yet a short, humorless sound. Would I be sitting here if it had? Something shifted in his expression then, a softening, a spark of what might have been hope. "So where does that leave us?" It was the question I had been avoiding since his email arrived, the one I couldn't answer even to myself. "I don't know," I said honestly. "This is impossible. You know that, right? You're my father-in-law. I'm married to your daughter. There's no scenario where this ends well for anyone." "I know," he said, pain flashing across his features. "Christ, don't you think I know that? Don't you think I've spent every day since Montana hating myself for feeling this way? For betraying Catherine? For betraying Emma?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "But then I got assigned to this aviation panel, and I saw your firm was hosting an event at the same hotel, and I had to see you, even if it was just to confirm that what I felt was real, that I hadn't imagined it. And now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now that you've seen me?" He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and longing. "Now I know I didn't imagine it," he said softly. "But I also know that nothing can come of this. Nothing should come of this." The words, sensible as they were, landed like blows. "So that's it? We acknowledge whatever this is, and then we just walk away?" "What's the alternative, Nathan?" he asked, genuine question in his voice. "An affair, sneaking around behind Emma's back, behind Catherine's? Is that really what either of us wants?" No, it wasn't. The very thought made me sick with guilt. And yet, the prospect of walking away from him again, of pretending that this connection didn't exist, seemed equally impossible. "I should go," I said suddenly, needing to escape, to think. "The symposium starts in an hour. I need to prepare." Richard nodded, disappointment flickering across his face before he masked it. "Of course, I understand." I stood, gathering my coat, avoiding his eyes. "I'll see you there? At the event?" "Yes," he said. "I'll be there." I turned to leave, had taken 2 steps, when his voice stopped me. "Nathan." I looked back. He was still seated, his expression open and vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. "I've never said this to another man before," he said quietly. "But I need you to know these past 3 months, thinking about you, about what might have been if things were different." He swallowed visibly. "It's been the most alive I've felt in 20 years. The words hit me like a physical blow. Without thinking, I took a step back toward him, then another, until I was standing beside his chair. "Meet me after," I heard myself say, the words coming from some reckless part of me I didn't recognize. "After the symposium, in the hotel bar." His eyes widened slightly. "Nathan." "Just to talk," I added quickly. I need more than this. More time before we—" I couldn't finish the thought. He nodded slowly. The bar. 9:30. 9:30, I echoed, then turned and walked away before I could do something foolish, something unforgivable, there in the lobby cafe with dozens of witnesses around us. The symposium passed in a blur. I gave my presentation on adaptive reuse, fielded questions, networked with colleagues, all on autopilot, my mind elsewhere, my eyes constantly scanning the crowd for a glimpse of salt and pepper hair, broad shoulders in a navy blazer. I spotted him once, standing at the back of the ballroom during my panel session, his expression attentive. Our eyes met briefly as I wrapped up my portion, and something electric passed between us, a current that seemed to bridge the distance. Then someone asked a question, pulling my attention away, and when I looked back, he was gone. By 9:25, I was sitting in the hotel bar, a whiskey neat in front of me. Untouched, the same brand we'd shared on the deck in Montana. I told myself I'd chosen it by chance. He arrived at 9:32. I'd been checking my watch every 30 seconds, looking slightly rumpled after a full day of travel and conferences. He spotted me immediately, as if some homing instinct drew his eyes to my corner table. Something in his expression changed when he saw me. A softening, a relief, as if he'd half expected me not to be there. "Sorry I'm late," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. My panel ran over. "It's fine," I replied, suddenly nervous now that he was here, now that this meeting, so carefully orchestrated to seem accidental should anyone ask, was actually happening. He ordered a drink from a passing server, the same whiskey I noticed, without my having to tell him, and then turned his attention fully to me. "Your presentation was excellent," he said. "You have a real gift for explaining complex concepts to lay people." I actually understood what adaptive reuse meant by the end of it. I smiled despite myself. "Thanks. How was your aviation panel?" "Dull as dishwater," he admitted with a small laugh. Industry veterans reminiscing about the good old days, while ignoring the sustainability issues staring us in the face. He shook his head. "I'm afraid I wasn't as diplomatic as I should have been during the Q&A. "Ruffled some feathers?" I asked, the unintentional pun making both of us smile. "You could say that." His drink arrived, and he raised it in a small toast. "To professional development," he said, eyes twinkling with the private joke. I clinked my glass against his. Professional development. We sipped in silence for a moment, the whiskey burning a familiar path down my throat. Around us, the bar hummed with activity. Other symposium attendees unwinding after a long day, hotel guests enjoying nightcaps, a pianist playing something soft and jazzy in the corner. "So," Richard said finally, "we're here, talking as promised." "Yes," I agreed, "talking." He studied me over the rim of his glass. "What do you want to talk about, Nathan?" It was a dangerously open question. There were so many things I wanted to ask him, to tell him, yet each felt like stepping onto thin ice. I settled for the most immediate. "Why did you really come to Boston?" He didn't flinch from the directness of the question. "The aviation symposium was real," he said. "But would I have accepted the speaking invitation if your firm's event wasn't happening at the same hotel?" He shook his head slightly. "Probably not." "So you came to see me," I said, needing to hear him say it. "I came to see you," he confirmed, his voice low and steady. "To see if what I felt in Montana was real or just some aberration. Some momentary madness brought on by circumstance." I took another sip of whiskey, liquid courage. "And?" His eyes, those startling jade green eyes, so like Emma's yet so different, held mine unflinchingly. "It wasn't momentary," he said simply, "and seeing you today only confirmed that. The admission should have sent me running. Instead, it anchored me to my seat, a strange calm settling over me despite the thundering of my heart. "I've never been attracted to a man before," I said, the words coming easier in the dim light of the bar, with whiskey warming my veins. "Never even considered it. And yet, with you—" I trailed off, struggling to articulate something I barely understood myself. "It's not about gender for me," Richard said thoughtfully. "At least, I don't think it is. It's about connection. Recognition. He leaned forward slightly. When I look at you, Nathan, I see someone who understands something essential about me, something I've kept hidden from everyone else. And I think... He hesitated, then pushed on. I think I see the same thing in you. His words resonated with the truth I'd been avoiding. Whatever this pull between us was, it went beyond physical attraction, beyond forbidden desire. It was about being seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time. I don't know what to do with this, I admitted, gesturing vaguely between us. I love Emma. I don't want to hurt her. I never... My voice caught. This isn't who I thought I was. I know, Richard said softly. Believe me, I know. I've spent 24 years building a life with Catherine. She's the mother of my child, my partner, my friend. I never intended to betray that. He stared into his whiskey. But I've also spent 25 years with this hollowness inside me. This sense that something fundamental was missing. That I was playing a role instead of living my life. He looked up at me. Until Montana. The implication hung in the air between us, that something had awakened in him when we met. Something long dormant. The same thing, perhaps, that had awakened in me. What are you saying? I asked, though part of me already knew. I'm saying that I think I've always known, deep down, that I was... different. That my attraction to men was something I buried so deep I could pretend it didn't exist. He took a steadying breath. Until I met you, and it all came rushing to the surface. The confession, so raw, so vulnerable, left me speechless. I thought of the unfinished sentence on the deck in Montana. I've always known I was... Why did you marry Catherine? I asked, the question escaping before I could consider its implications. If he was offended, he didn't show it. Because I loved her, he said simply. I still do, in many ways, and because it was expected. The natural progression. Pilot marries flight attendant. They have a child. Build a life. He smiled sadly. It's a good life, too. I don't want you to think it isn't. Catherine is a wonderful woman. We built something real together. But there was always something missing. Something I couldn't name or wouldn't. He finished his whiskey, setting the glass down with careful precision. Have you ever worn a pair of shoes that almost fit? They're not uncomfortable enough to discard, but never quite right. That's been my life. Almost fitting, almost right. Almost enough. The analogy struck a chord so deep I nearly gasped. Hadn't I felt the same these past months? These past years? The nagging sense that something was off, something was missing, even as I went through the motions of a life that looked perfect on paper. I don't want to be the reason your marriage fails, I said, the words catching in my throat. I don't want to be the reason Emma gets hurt. And I don't want to be the reason for that either, Richard replied earnestly. God, Nathan, the last thing I would ever want is to hurt my daughter, or you, or Catherine. Then what are we doing here? I asked, frustration bleeding into my voice. What's the point of acknowledging this? Whatever this is, if we can never act on it? Richard was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on the table. Finally, he looked up, his expression both resolute and vulnerable. Maybe the point is just to know, he said softly, to know that I'm not alone in feeling this way, that the connection I felt wasn't one-sided, that for once in my life, I'm being honest, with myself, with someone else, about who I really am. His words stripped me bare, exposing the truth I'd been avoiding, that perhaps this wasn't about an affair, about sex, about forbidden romance. Perhaps it was about recognition, about seeing and being seen, about the profound relief of dropping a mask worn so long it had become a second skin. I didn't expect this, I said finally. Any of this. When I met Emma, when I married her, I thought I knew who I was, what I wanted. And now, I looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the warmth in his eyes, the gentle strength that radiated from him. Now I don't know anything except that when I'm with you, I feel awake. like I've been sleepwalking through my own life until now. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a surrender. Without warning, his hand moved across the table, fingers brushing against mine in a touch so brief it could have been accidental. But we both knew it wasn't. "Come upstairs with me," he said, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the bar. The invitation hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility, with danger. I stared at him, heart hammering against my ribs. "Richard." Thanksgiving, nearly 3 weeks away. It seemed both an eternity and the blink of an eye. "And then?" I pressed, needing some framework, some understanding of what lay ahead. "Then we see where we are," he said simply. "We take the time between now and then to think, to process, to be sure about what we want." I nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words, even as my heart rebelled against the separation. "And if what I want is you?" I asked, the question barely audible. His expression softened, his thumb brushing across my lower lip. "Then we figure it out," he promised. "Together." It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was all either of us could offer in that moment. A promise to not let this connection, whatever it was, whatever it might become, slip away unacknowledged. "I should go," I repeated, making no move toward the door. "You should," he agreed, making no move to release me. Instead, he leaned forward, pressing his lips to mine in a kiss that felt like both a beginning and an ending, tender, thorough, laden with everything we couldn't say. When we finally broke apart, I forced myself to step back, to create distance. "Goodbye, Richard," I said, reaching for my jacket, my keys, the trappings of the life that waited beyond the hotel room door. "Not goodbye," he corrected gently. "Just until Thanksgiving." I nodded, throat tight with emotion. "Until Thanksgiving." At the door, I paused, looking back at him. This man who had upended my life, my understanding of myself, in the span of a single week in Montana and one night in Boston. He stood tall in the morning light, his expression a complex mixture of longing and resolve. "Richard," I said, the words coming before I could second-guess them. "I'm glad you emailed me. I'm glad you came." A smile touched his lips, sad but genuine. "So am I, Nathan," he replied. "So am I." I closed the door behind me, the soft click of the latch, a period at the end of one chapter, the beginning of another. As I walked down the hotel corridor toward the elevator, I felt both lighter and heavier than I had the day before. Lighter for having finally acknowledged the truth I'd been avoiding for months, heavier with the knowledge of the difficult path that lay ahead. Whatever happened next, whether this connection with Richard could survive in the light of day, whether it would wither under the weight of familial obligation and societal expectation, one thing was certain. I was changed. Irrevocably, fundamentally changed. For the first time in my life, I had been truly seen. For the first time, I had been honest, with myself, with another person, about who I was, what I wanted. That truth, once acknowledged, could never be unlearned, never be forgotten. As the elevator doors closed, carrying me down to the lobby and the world that waited beyond, I carried with me the memory of Richard's touch, his voice, his understanding. Whatever came next, guilt, confusion, difficult choices, I would face it with a new awareness of myself, a new standard for what connection could feel like. It wasn't a resolution, not by any means. It was a beginning. Terrifying, exhilarating, fraught with potential for both joy and pain. But as I stepped out into the crisp Boston morning, the sun climbing over the city skyline, I found myself embracing that uncertainty with a strange, newfound courage. The future, our future, remained unwritten. But for the first time in my life, I was truly, fully awake to witness it unfold.